Shanda Vander Ark sat on the witness stand, her hands trembling as she stared ahead, her mind a blur. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The judge had called for the display of evidence, and Shanda knew what was coming. She had been called to testify, but this was not a moment of justice for her son. It was the moment when everything she had tried to bury would be dragged into the light. The prosecutor, his voice steady, lifted the evidence in front of the jury. It was a photo, Timothy's last moments. The image that Shanda had tried to forget, the one she had avoided ever since that night. Her stomach churned as the photograph was passed around the courtroom. The graphic image of her son's lifeless body was too much for her to bear. She gagged, her breath caught in her throat, and for a split second it felt as though the walls of the room were closing in on her. She had thought she was prepared. She had told herself that this moment would come, that justice for Timothy would require facing the horrific reality of what had happened to him. Shanda's older son, the one she had raised alongside Timothy, had been arrested just days before. In that moment the truth was undeniable. Her son was gone, her family was broken, and nothing would ever be the same. In the small town of Muskegon, Michigan, where life seemed peaceful and predictable, the quiet home at the end of the street hid a darkness that no one could have imagined. From the outside, it was just another house with drawn curtains and a neglected yard, the kind of place neighbors stopped noticing after a while. But within its walls lay a haunting story of suffering and betrayal that would shock the entire community. Timothy Ferguson was born in 2007, a child full of softness and innocence. His blonde hair framed his cherubic face, and his curious blue eyes lit up whenever he encountered the simple joys of life, cartoons, puzzles, or feeling the cool earth under his hands. But Timothy was not like other children. He had developmental disabilities that made him more vulnerable, more dependent on those who were meant to love and protect him. Unfortunately for Timothy, love and protection were foreign concepts in the world he called home. His mother, Shanda Vander Ark, was known to be stern, her voice sharp enough to silence a room. People who encountered her said she carried an air of control, a presence that brooked no disobedience. Timothy's older brother, Paul Ferguson, barely a young man himself, fell in line beneath Shanda's strict authority. The absence of Timothy's father was a closed chapter in the family's history, spoken of in murmurs and never in detail. Neighbors rarely saw Timothy outside. While other children played and screamed in the summer sun, Timothy's world remained locked away behind smudged windows and heavy curtains. When questioned, Shanda would smile tightly and dismiss the concerns. Timothy was delicate, she said, and the outside world wasn't good for him. As months passed, Timothy's presence faded into an eerie silence that should have been noticed, but wasn't. The abuse didn't begin with brutality. It was quiet at first, almost insidious. Shanda's punishment started small, denying Timothy sweets or locking him in his room for spilling something. Family members who now regret their silence saw only glimpses of her cold discipline. To them, it was strict parenting, nothing more. But inside the house, the cruelty began to fester, growing sharper with every passing day. Teachers were the first to see the signs when Timothy was still attending school. His clothes hung loosely on his small frame, his lunchbox often empty or filled with scraps. Timothy stopped looking people in the eye. When spoken to, he would shrink into himself, his voice barely audible. Concerned teachers reached out to Shanda, but their worries were met with calculated explanations. Soon after, Shanda pulled Timothy out of school entirely, citing the need for homeschooling to care for his fragile health. It was the last time anyone outside the house would see him. With the world locked away, Timothy's life transformed into something unimaginable. Meals became a form of punishment, not nourishment. Shanda began feeding Timothy a single slice of bread drenched in hot sauce. If he cried or refused, she would force it into his mouth, her face void of empathy. Food that filled the family pantry was kept under lock and key, forbidden to Timothy. At night, Shanda and Paul subjected him to ice baths, holding him in freezing water until his body shivered uncontrollably. If he cried out, his pleas were met with nothing but stone-cold silence. The room Timothy was confined to was no bedroom. It was a closet, small, windowless, and bare. For hours, sometimes days, Timothy sat in that suffocating darkness. His body grew weaker, his voice quieter, until eventually he learned that silence was safer. Paul, once his older brother, became his enforcer. He carried out Shanda's orders without hesitation, sending messages back and forth with chilling obedience. Timothy's suffering was no accident. It was systematic, deliberate, and merciless.
She starved him to. She's asking you to do all these things that are literally your brother. I know she's not perfect. How is that love? How is love? How is love ice baths? How is love? How is love handcuffing? And how is love restricting movement? And how is love hot sauce in the mouth and only eating bread? What if you only got to eat bread? How would you feel? What if you only got to eat bread with hot sauce?
By the summer of 2022, Timothy was a shadow of the boy he once was. His limbs were skeletal, his joints swollen, his skin pale and bruised. On July 6th, Timothy's body finally gave up. The day was unremarkable to the world outside, but inside the house, Timothy lay curled in a fetal position, his fragile body cold and still. When paramedics arrived, summoned by a perfunctory 911 call from Shanda, they found no signs of life. The air in the house was heavy and silent, as though the walls themselves were ashamed of what they had seen. Shanda stood nearby, her expression as blank as ever, insisting she didn't know what had happened, but the paramedics knew better. Investigators arrived shortly after, peeling back the layers of cruelty that had taken place inside those walls. What they discovered was more horrifying than anyone could have prepared for. Evidence of Timothy's torture was everywhere. Buckets from the ice baths, the locked pantry stocked with food he was never allowed to eat, the messages exchanged between Shanda and Paul.
Crazy idea. Ask G if he wants some pizza rolls and heat up a set of pizza rolls and take one downstairs and offer it to Timothy and see what he does. Put it right in front of his mouth, but be ready to yank it back if he tries to eat it.
It was clear that Timothy had been starved, frozen, and neglected until his small body could endure no more. The case quickly escalated into a public outrage. Shanda Vander Ark and Paul Ferguson were arrested within days, and the story of Timothy Ferguson's suffering spread like wildfire. The trial that followed was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in painstaking detail, describing the torment Timothy endured as systematic torture. Medical examiners explained how Timothy's body had wasted away, how the hypothermia and malnutrition had caused a slow, painful death. Paul Ferguson, overwhelmed by the weight of his guilt, pleaded guilty to his role in the abuse. He received 30 to 100 years in prison. Shanda Vander Ark showed no remorse throughout the proceedings. Her stoic expression never faltered as the jury delivered their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder and child abuse. Judge Matthew Casel spared no words during sentencing. Shanda was given life imprisonment without parole plus an additional 50 years. Let me know, what do you think of this case and which you would like to see next? Till next time.